I would like to give a special thanks to Joshua Abbey and the Las Vegas Jewish Film Festival and Jolie Brislin of the ADL of Nevada. I also would like to give a special thank you to the Robinson and Frankoff families. This webinar is being recorded and will be available to watch starting tomorrow on the Jewish Nevada YouTube page. I did want to share a personal story. After watching this film, something reminded me of something that I'm very proud about that I'd like to share. I was born on April 6, 1968. What is significant about this date, you ask? Well, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated just 2 days earlier on April 4th, 1968. For those of you who don't know, it's a tradition for Jewish people to use the first letter of a deceased relative's name for their newborns. My first name was named after my great-grandfather Nathan. I'm very proud to tell you that my parents had the courage to give me the middle name of Martin, not after a deceased relative, but after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
Wow.
52 years ago. I get choked up when I say that, when I think about it sometimes, but it's something that I'm very proud of. Once our Q&A with our panelists is over or finished, I will then ask questions from our participants. If you have a question for any of our panelists, please use the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. We will ask as many questions as we can in the time allotted. I now have the pleasure to introduce you all to our distinguished panel. Claytee White is the director of UNLV Oral History Research Center. Heather Booth is a social change organizer. Dr. Shari Rogers is the director of Shared Legacies and president of Spill the Honey Foundation. And lastly, Joshua Abbey, director of the Las Vegas Jewish Film Festival. I'd like to hand over the webinar to Joshua.
Greetings, everyone. Can everyone hear and see me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Neil Martin Popish, very much for enlightening us about your birthright. And I think we all share a sense of ownership in the birthright to acknowledge the importance of Reverend King and his role today in helping us shape our response to the crisis our nation faces. And we're very fortunate to have an exceptional group joining us today to comment on the film that I'm assuming every one of you have all seen. So I'm going to just jump right into the discussion. Let's start with our distinguished guest, who is the director of the film, Dr. Shari Rogers. Shari, can you tell us what your ideals for this project was, how it originated, and what the reaction thus far has been? I know it had a tremendous premiere in it at the Atlanta Jewish Film Festival. So if you could just summarize those aspects of it, that would be very helpful for us.
Sure. First, I want to shout out to my sister, Nicole Weissman, that lives in Las Vegas. So I have a family member that lives there that I need to say hello to. But I live in Michigan, and I happen to be at the Charles Wright Museum in Detroit, Michigan. And I was at a lecture by Dr. Clarence B. Jones, who actually was chosen by Claiborne Carson to be the inside thinker of Dr. King at Stanford. And he was not only his legal counsel, Dr. Martin Luther King's, but also his speechwriter. And he had just written a book, What Would Martin Say? And one of the chapters was on anti-Semitism. And I was just astounded to think that he wrote a whole chapter on the importance of the Jewish people to Dr. King. And we developed a friendship from that lecture. And he had specifically been given a dictum by Dr. King. He said, if our brothers, at the time he used the word Negro, if our Negro brothers of our Black brothers speak negatively about the Jewish people, I know you, Clarence, will remind them of the 24/7 commitment that the Jewish people had to our struggle. So we developed this amazing friendship, and fast forward, he was honored by the Kennedy Center for Performing Arts. The Obamas were there. And a few years later, it was the 50th anniversary from the Selma to Montgomery March, and President Obama had just invited Clarence to the Oval Office, and he said, "I hope you're going to be there, Clarence." And he said, "I will, of course I will." And so, when I started to look to see, is there any films or more books on the subject matter, I thought, how amazing if we could start filming right in Selma, since Selma represents the bridge and where many people of many faiths came together, including the Jewish people, that eventuated in the Voting Rights Act. So that's where we started filming at the anniversary of the Selma to Montgomery March.
And since the film has been completed, Shari, what were your ideals for it? What would you like to see this film achieve?
Well, I hope it provides a bridge and an actual testimony from the firsthand eyewitnesses to this history, both from the Jewish community and from the Black community, that basically many of them are in their 90s. I mean, you have from Rabbi Gendler, who was one of the interviewers of Dr. King a week before he was assassinated at the Conservative Assembly in the Catskills, from Congressman John Lewis and Ambassador Young, all giving testimony to this history. And just like the opening at the Atlanta Jewish Film Festival, there was 2,500 people. It was an amazing, diverse audience. We actually won the jury prize for bridge building. It was just an opportunity to all come together to see how, even though we might have had some differences back then, there was enough commonality between our two communities that we got a lot of work accomplished. And I think, by knowing this template, we can use this template as a bridge builder to draw upon, especially while many of these amazing activists are alive, that we can draw from them.
Thank you for having the vision and the wherewithal and the talent to create this important work. And I think we all agree it couldn't be more timely. I'd like to segue into Heather and Claytee's impressions of the film. Let's start with Claytee. You just saw it recently, Claytee. How did you react to it?
So I thought it was a very powerful film, and it was a slice of history that I wasn't as aware of as I thought. I thought I knew all civil rights history, but there was a large segment about the Jewish community. Of course, I know a lot about it because of Rabbi Prince and the film that we've already seen about his activism and his union with Martin Luther King Jr. I didn't know how widespread this community had been. I realized that there had always been a lot of financial support. I didn't realize that there was that much support on the ground. So it was just a slice of history that taught me a great deal. And what Dr. Rogers just said about the commonalities, I think we see it happening already. I think we see it in the protest march of today. We have Latino people, we have Native Americans, we have whites, and we have Jewish people, we have Black people, everybody marching in the street. And it's all over the world, not just here in the US.
Yesterday, on the floor of the Senate, they read aloud, senators, the letter written by Dr. King in the Birmingham jail in 1963.
I listened to that as well.
And Heather, what was your impression? That was not the first time they had done that, but how do you feel the Congress is going to take advantage of this moment to make changes that we have not seen that will be lasting? And in general, your impressions of the film and its role right now.
First, going back to the film, I want to thank you particularly, Joshua, for airing this remarkable film at the festival, and to thank also Neil and the JCC, and also all the people who are watching this. I understand there were over 200 people who subscribed to it, and that it may be the largest turnout that you've had for one of these virtual viewings, because the film is so relevant both to our history and also to the events of today, just as Claytee said. And also, I'm gratified that there's such a turnout, because people who are watching it, it indicates the level of shared values, shared commitments, some shared history, and then a complicated history that's being remade today. For what I think on the film had me from the first opening line. There was a saying that said, if the lions don't tell their story, the hunters will get the credit. Right now, the hunters get the credit, and we need to have our story told of people organizing. And Dr. Rogers did a wonderful job in telling this story. I associated with it a great deal. I started my work in the civil rights movement in 1960. I was in Mississippi in 1964 with the Freedom Summer, and have continued that work on women's issues, immigration, and many other issues, even through till today. And just as Claytee said, there really is what many call now intersectionality. There's a combining of efforts and support in many ways for moving forward. For what will happen in the Congress overall, the House and the Senate, and a president who needs to support changes going forward, it's not exactly clear to me which direction we'll take, because I feel we're at a turning point between peril and promise. It's both an inspiring moment in that we see people in the streets and organizing and raising their voices and showing such moral concern and getting the attention of the country. And there also is a possibility that, just as the issues have been raised before, when the letter from a Birmingham jail was read on the floor of the House before, or when the Kerner Commission made its statement in 1968 that there was, that the 68 uprisings also reflected a crisis of Black and white that needed to be addressed. And not enough certainly has been done in those prior crises. And so it's up to all of us to see, will we make the change that's needed at this moment of crisis?
So to all of you, what is the catalyst? What is the original initiative now that's going to change the pattern of these types of social movement coming to the fore and then quickly fading? I mean, we saw tremendous student uprising to the school shootings, and there was so much promise held in those young voices. And then the news cycle just passed them by. And how can we make sure that this time is different? What is the catalyst that's going to really create the traction that's necessary to see the social change we all dream of? Claytee, you have an idea?
So I think that everyone now, finally, we're beginning to understand what systemic racism is. And I think because people finally know that this is more than eating in a restaurant with someone or not riding in the back of the bus, that this is much larger, that we are talking about things as fundamental as my interest rates might be different, so banking policies have to change. Housing policies have to change. Redlining just have to change. Education is not equal. Justice is unjust. The legal system, the criminal system, sentencing, arrest, It is unequal. If I have Black skin and someone else has white skin, every system in the country is not equal any longer. Has never been. But now we're finally beginning to see that. And because the anger is at the point that people have risen up all over the world. Cape Town, South Africa is rising up talking about injustice in the United States of America. So I think we have reached the point because people are listening.
And on, oh, I'm sorry, but on the thing of why we can't wait from the Birmingham jail, I just think we're at a point between that Mr. Floyd it was a watershed moment that we had just had enough. And that's where film, seeing, the police officer putting his foot, his knee on his neck, and we're hearing his pain and his words and actually seeing it, was reminiscent of the 60s in many ways when we saw the hosing of the children and the hosing. And I just think at certain points in history, we've just had enough. And with the coronavirus, and many in the Black community didn't have equal access to their health care, and many of them were dying at a larger rate. I just think as a humankind and as a people, we want to have what's alienable rights that our Constitution has promised us, equal access, the freedom.
Heather, how do we do this without an iconic leader like a Dr. King in the present? Can we do it without?
The way the change really happens is when people organize, when each of us takes action that we can take, that we can find ways to take, that we look for ways to take. And if we organize, we can change the world, but nothing is a given. Nothing's for sure that the change will happen now unless we organize. And that means both personal education, and for white people, it means coming to understand what is the depth of the experience of African Americans in this country. I watched the movie 13 last night, which is an Anna DuVernay movie about the criminalization of such a large portion of the Black population. There's a book I just read called White Fragility. There's actually all the books on the New York Times book list this week are all guided to help people understand. So there's personal education. Then there's social action of just showing up. Juneteenth, I think Claytee mentioned it already. It's the date that, didn't mention, sorry Claytee, but that it was the day that the rest of the country came to understand it was really the official end of slavery when word came to Texas that slavery was over. Well, June 19th, it's going to be a date where Black Lives Matter and many organizations have called for a day of action, commemoration. There are websites you can go to just looking for it. There'll be places to act either publicly for those who feel safe to do that, or privately. And then there is social and structural reform to invest in the communities and divest from a militarization of a police force that has been, that hasn't engaged with many communities and hasn't engaged in the African American community as is now needed, as well as those issues of economic and healthcare and other issues. You asked a second question, or your main question really was about leadership. One thing I'd say is that there always has been vast leadership in various movements. One of the wonderful things about Dr. Rogers' movie is that it showed, in addition to Dr. King's remarkable leadership, there also was other leadership. Many people whose names we may not know. And now there's remarkable leadership, especially from young people and young women of color. Arisha Hatch, Alicia Garza, Rashad Robinson. There are many, many young leaders who are coming to the fore. And I'm actually, as someone who started when I was in my early teens. I'll be 75 this year. I'm so thrilled by the creativity and the courage of a new generation of leadership coming to the fore.
Claytee.
And even back in the
Sorry.
60s, we sometimes forget how young Dr. King was and how young some of the leadership was back then. And now there's Jews of color like that are taking very strong leadership roles, like Yavila McCoy, that can really help us understand the experience of both the Jewish experience and the Black experience, that I think is very important. And we have this template. I keep going back to the film and the importance of looking at Dr. King and restudying him and his relationships with Rabbi Heschel and with others, and teaching about the strength to love. So even if there's differences, he would find the commonality in the people that were different from him, and making sure that each person felt respected and was valued as a human being.
So I think systemic racism is the linchpin. When a whole group of people have never been treated equal to other people in the country, and now people are finally beginning to understand, companies are beginning to understand. We had a whole page ad from Bank of America the other day, finally realizing what redlining has done in Black communities, and are now ready to start putting monies into these communities. That's what we need. We have leadership in all kinds of groups. We don't need leadership. We need people who are going to change laws, change policies, change practices, starting with the US Congress, and starting in your local neighborhoods at the same time. This has to be done now. We have to look at every system in the United States of America. Every system has to change. That change has to start now. And finally, people are beginning to understand American history. I don't call it African American history anymore, because people become blind to what I'm saying. They stop listening when I title it like that. So it's American history. When you go back to 1619, and so 401 years now, there has been no equality in this country, and it is finally about to happen. This is what we need to keep our focus on.
You know, there's one of the women who really inspired the creation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was Ella Baker, who herself should be recognized. But one of the famous things she said was, a strong people don't need strong leaders. And right now there's a strong grassroots movement that's moving forward, and we need to provide support to help see that it helps achieve some of the goals that it's raised now.
And I don't know if people are aware of this, for the first time in history, our own Congresswoman from Michigan, Congresswoman Brenda Lawrence, has initiated with Congressman John Lewis a bipartisan Black Jewish caucus in Congress. So I think, there's a recognition in Congress also that our two communities can be very helpful to each other and need to work together to get things done in the government.
White
Go
supremacy,
ahead, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
white supremacy has ruled the United States of America for 400 years. We are finally beginning to see how that has worked. And until we understand that more and more and understand history, I'm talking about the history from Jamestown, 1619, until today, 2020. That is the history that is so very, very vital and so important that we look at. That there has been a group of people that has never had equality any place at any time from any system in America. And now those systems are beginning to tumble, and we have to let them completely tumble down. And if we have to be in the streets for the next 5 years to do that, that's where we need to be.
I keep thinking about the term coalition of conscience, which was the way King described his ambition to bring people together. And he reached out primarily to his fellow spiritual leaders, and then to the multi-generational grassroots people that shared, the need for empathy and broader understanding. How high are the stakes right now that we are able to achieve significant, measurable, constructive results? And what are the consequences if we don't? How critical is this moment in history?
When there's a crisis, we often make the greatest progress. In 1964 in Mississippi summer, when poor Black people in Mississippi lived in terror, the story told of the 3 young boys, the volunteers, Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney, who were killed by the Klan, and bodies of 8 other Black men found at that point, whose disappearances weren't even reported because Black lives did not matter in Mississippi, but because people organized. Within a year, there was a Voting Rights Act. And progress gets made when we do what Claytee said, that we stand, that we are in the streets and in the halls of Congress and voting and doing every part of what we can do to advance things, or we can miss that moment. And that's why I say it can either be promise or peril. It depends on what we do.
And the Jewish people understand the importance of history. So when people say, why does history have to be brought up again? We're moving forward. We understand when we invoke our own slavery from 3,000 years ago, how that history can be living today, and that we need to stand up for any type of injustice today, and that we can't just ever minimize the importance of going back and really having empathy for the transgenerational wounds that have taken place and continue to take place. And I think the Jewish experience, the Jews historically, many of the Jews understood the Black experience, not exactly the same, but they could have empathy just coming off the Holocaust and their own history. But I think I'm thrilled that there's a new lynching museum and the new African American museum, and all these museums, not just as museums, but to honor and to be able to study the experience in America, for the Black experience.
So Blacks still live in terror today. And when we say terrorism, we didn't understand that word until 9/11. Well, Black communities understood terrorism since 1619. We understand that. We understand that the KKK was a terrorist group from the very beginning. So Blacks are still living in terror right now, that we have to have the conversation, the talk with our children, because we're so afraid that their hand will slip off the steering wheel while the police officer is standing there. And if it slips, you may end up shot. So we are still living in terror. And this is the first time that there has been more promise in such a long time. Someone just used, I think it was Heather, just used the term a watershed moment. And this is it. This is it. I think that we have the opportunity now to go forward in a way that we've never had the opportunity before. We have an alignment of groups that feel and understand, finally, all over the world.
In Dr. King's letter from the Birmingham jail, he shares that if he had lived in Nazi Germany, he would not be silent when they came for his neighbors.
Exactly.
That he was willing to martyr his life if necessary to stand up for what's right.
Though Joshua, I want to raise as a question as part of the Jewish community, as coming into social action out of the kind of Jewish social justice concerns that Dr. Rogers described. I believed it was part of the Jewish tradition, our history, our culture, our learning. But by the end of the 60s, for a variety of reasons, there was a fracturing, and if not a hiatus, not a full hiatus, a slowing down of Jewish communal social involvement in social justice. And that went on for almost 30 years. There are many reasons for it, from having to do with that Jews as white people were often the last people in Black communities, often became a target of anger at white people, that there were Jewish fears about continuity of the Jewish population because of intermarriage. And so a lot of the funding in the Jewish community went toward internal, other important things, but Jewish education in day schools, other important things, but not of social action. And then there were questions of the increasing primacy of the importance of Israel. And as a result, again, funding just went to different directions. A friend of mine, some of you may know the name, Leonard Fine, who started Moment Magazine. He started the Jewish Literacy Project and the Jewish Hunger Project. This is a booklet that he wrote. It was called Smashing Idols. And it was a recognition that there had been this period of intense Jewish social justice activism. And then almost a 30-year hiatus. At that point, he and some others hired me to create an organization that would try and reinstill social justice in the heart of the Jewish community. And there has been a new flowering of social justice, of Jews United for Justice, of Bend the Arc, of National Council of Jewish Women has taken on a much more vital direction, and many other groups. But what happens now has to be a redefinition of that relationship between the Jews and African Americans, recognizing that the Jewish community has also changed, the role of Jews of color, as well as the dynamic leadership that the African American community is providing. And we need to find new terms by which we engage in this period, not just resting on the remarkable history of the past.
I want to acknowledge the work of our local Anti-Defamation League has been very strong in building coalitions throughout the community against intolerance and hate and addressing the rise in anti-Semitism. They also have a very unique relationship with law enforcement. So they have a potential very constructive role in that regard to helping shape the policy reforms that are necessary. I want to open it up to our listeners because I'm sure they're also very eager to participate in the conversation. Neil, are you still with us? Do you have some questions from the audience that you can pose?
I am still here, of course. I have a question from a Morris, and the question is directed towards either Claytee or Shari. As the son of Holocaust survivors, I'm deeply interested as to whether African Americans relate to the Holocaust experience, and are there any particular or specific aspects which resonate with them?
I think African Americans relate. I think they're in alignment with, and they relate very, very well to the Holocaust experience. And you have to remember that the Holocaust starts in the 1930s, goes until the 1940s. We had African American troops who helped to liberate some of the camps in Europe. We know about the Holocaust. We understand the Holocaust. We understand Hitler. We understand what was happening in Germany at the time. We understand what concentration camps are. We understand what it did to a whole generation of Jewish people. We also understand what has happened to African Americans in this country, starting in 1619, coming forward to 2020. So we have a very complicated history. And yes, we understand the entire history. We don't have anything against aligning with and protesting with other groups who don't have equality either. It is not an either or, it's an and. We're all here together. What I am trying to say today is that because of the color of my skin, nothing else, because of the color of my skin, that my interest rates are different from your interest rates. My housing privileges are different from your housing privileges. My health care is different from your health care. My schooling, my education for myself and my children are all different from your education. Any system in America, getting a job is different for me than for you getting a job. And this has never changed. This has been this way since slavery, and it is still this way today. So yes, we understand the Holocaust. We understand it very well. We know what the United States did was wrong at the beginning of the Holocaust when we turned ships away and did not allow Jewish people to come into the country. That's part of American history. We understand the whole thing.
Thank you. I have a question from Jill. It's not directed towards anyone in particular. The question is, unfortunately, the Black-Jewish relationship is not as strong as it was during the Civil Rights Movement. Many Jews support the mission of Black Lives Matter, but are put off by its leaders' anti-Israel stance. I'd like to hear the speaker's thoughts on the relationship between the two communities today and possible ways to improve it.
Well, I think it's important to try to focus as much as we can on what we can do together here in America. And I think taking the model of Dr. King and Rabbi Heschel, this idea that there can be differences, and there were differences even back in the 60s in terms of even if Dr. King was completely pro-Israel, if there was some experience that the Black experience might not have understood all the connection to Israel, that there was enough to do in America that we can work on. So I think the key is to find the commonality and to be able to have safe dialogue, to be able to break down barriers where we can feel safe enough to really freely associate and work together. I mean, I think that really is the key. And, you know, just like there are many Jewish, there's many in the Jewish community that we're not a monolith. We don't all agree with each other. The Black experience doesn't agree all with each other. I know very many ministers and many different leadership who are very supportive of Israel, and likewise that there's certain situations where there isn't. But I think that if we can break down the barriers and be honest with each other and work towards relationships, that I think we can build bridges and communicate, and dialogue is what's key.
I think that we are all one. I think there is one creator, one supreme being. So I see us as all one. I think sometimes the problems in one community become so harsh, so oppressive, so complex that we just go within and try to solve some of those problems. When we were trying to solve the problems of drugs, illegal drugs in the African American community in the 70s and 80s, and we were talking about crack cocaine and those kinds of things, and our Black men were going to jail in just huge numbers, yes, we went in to try to solve those kinds of problems, and we couldn't do it by ourselves. And today now, There is the same kind of problem in white communities in Kansas and Nebraska and everywhere else. And the solutions are entirely different. The solution now is that it's a healthcare crisis. Nobody is going to jail. No families are being broken up. So yes, sometimes a community has so many problems within that no one without understands that sometimes you have to go within and work on those problems. And that started happening at the end of the civil rights movement. We saw drugs coming into the Black community in ways that no one realized. Black men started going to jail. Black families came apart. All of those situations happened. The Black Power movement, there were all kinds of things happening at that end of that civil rights movement that took our eye off the prize for a minute. It's back on the prize now.
I would say that this moment is a very important opportunity for the Jewish community to evaluate its identity and its priorities in terms of, like Heather said, re-engaging with social justice, using our unique strengths to help heal and find concrete ways forward that will unite us and make us stronger as a community and get above the fundamental us and them conflict where the other is always the problem. You know, how do we hold our traditions and our uniqueness, but at the same time be confident enough to be open to embrace, as Claytee said, all, because we're part of the all.
Joshua, I think we also can't forget how important the Exodus story was to the whole civil rights movement and how Dr. King used so many of the Old Testament quotes and stories to empower the movement during the civil rights. And the Exodus is about social justice. It's about tikkun olam. It's about valuing the inalienable rights of each human being. So I think, you know, we as Jewish people, we also should also feel we can evoke some of our own religion to connect it to social justice, not as a disconnection, but also to reconnect to our own narrative as part of social justice.
But there are many parts of the Exodus story, which is, I mean, my favorite holiday is Passover. It's a major event in our house and our extended family, because it is the celebration not only of freedom, but of the struggle for freedom, of organizing. We should remember that I'm a nonviolent person, by the way. I'm a nonviolent person. But we should remember in the Exodus story, Moses kills an overseer who's beating a slave. This was not a nonviolent action. And then coming through the desert, all those who were coming through the desert didn't make it to the promised land because they were too much a part of an old culture. A new generation had to come through that desert and make it to the promised land. We may not all make it to the promised land, as Dr. King said, but our children and our grandchildren might carry on that struggle. It's not a struggle that ends. It's not a struggle that has one romanticized, simple story. It often is a story of struggle. And so to understand the struggle of these days, particularly, I think we Jews need to listen to what Black Lives Matter and the Black community is saying. What do they mean? What are their concerns? How are all the issues of healthcare inequality, of economic inequality, of education inequality, how is it all tied together? And how can we make a difference in our own lives? How can we learn? And how can we address the systemic causes beyond individual actions, but really look for systemic change that will take legislation and electing those leadership who actually want to embody and carry through with an agenda of making that change.
Most powerful symbol of the Seder, the traditional Passover dinner for me, is the empty seat at the table for Elijah, who represents the stranger and the other, and how we as Jews have an obligation to help everyone who reaches out.
And we should remember that even the Jewish tradition is a tradition that involves sometimes very intense struggle. On the holiest day of the year for Jews, on Yom Kippur, we say, "Is this the fast that I command of you, to sit in sackcloth and ashes and humble yourself?" And the answer is no. What I command of you is to break the bonds of wickedness. Let the oppressed go free. This is an activist organizing, sometimes troublemaking, in the words of Congressman John Lewis, making good trouble. And this also is part of the movement that we need to learn about and engage.
Rabbi Dresner tells a story that Dr. King would admire the Passover dinner, how the younger kids would ask the questions, and how much he said that our people need to feel empowered by our history and not empowered, that the slavery is used to empower you so that you never will be enslaved, and stand for the other, and it's not to feel minimized, and how important telling over that story to the young children is, and empowering that history. And actually a week, he was supposed to have dinner at Rabbi Heschel's house for Passover the following week before he was assassinated. And you can imagine what it would have been like for Dr. King to have dinner at the Heschel home for Passover, what that whole experience would have been like.
Claytee, when someone comes to you now and says, "I want to help, what can I do?" What is the simple, tangible task that you would encourage them to undertake at this moment?
So to me, the most simple thing you can do is that when you're in a room with people and people begin to say derogatory things about another group, no matter which other group it is, that you stand up and you not allow that to happen. And then the second thing is for all of us to start learning history and not be afraid. Yes, there's some ugly things in our history, but we can't be afraid of it. We just have to learn history. We need to know Native American history, and I shouldn't even label it like that. We have to learn American history, and we need to include everyone in that history. And that's what we don't do. We don't understand. We don't understand enough about our country, our world, and why we are here today at this point, having to have this conversation. We don't understand. So I just want people to have courage. I just want people to have courage and to stand up.
Beautifully put.
Particularly this year, there's so many things to do, not only the joining in and support of those events that are happening, tumultuous events, and who knows what will be happening in the future. But we now have 4 months or so until an election that may itself be a watershed election. And we've seen how African Americans in particular, but also others, have been excluded from voting, cut from the rolls, when in fact, my middle initial is T, but did I put down Heather T. Booth or did I put down Heather Booth? Well, I could be excluded for it. Or in Florida, people who had served their time and re-entered society, had been formally convicted, then got the right to vote, and then they put on a poll tax. We had fought against the poll tax, but you had to pay all your fines, many of which had been questionable about why those why the fines and how appropriate they were, but it's in effect an additional poll tax for people who don't have the funds anyway. And so we can be involved in the election, in voter registration, in getting out the vote, and ensuring that we protect the vote, as well as for showing up in those events and activities that will be happening now, that will be making living history, building on the background of the very events that Dr. Rogers described in the movie.
I would say we need to really, through introspection, understand what we are grateful for and who helped us achieve those things that we're grateful for, and what was the motivation that led them to help lift us up, and how we can pass on that energy that was so fundamental to who we are.
Just as each of our individual histories as Jewish people and the Black history is important, also our shared history and how we work together to accomplish things needs to be included as part of that history. And I'm hoping that our film sheds that history, where I think we captured these living witnesses to the shared history that I think we can't forget and draw upon as we move forward.
And that's why I have stopped calling it African American history, Native American history, and I call it American history, because we need to learn the entire story. And now it's world history that we don't know.
I hope you see, Shari, how powerful your work is to
Yes.
create and stimulate this kind of conversation. You should, be applauded
Exactly.
for your effort. Thank you so much.
Yeah, Dr. Rogers, actually, Howard has a question on how he can obtain the lyrics to the song "Long Time Coming" and the download of the song by Zarina. Is that possible?
Yeah, we will. It is actually, it's an amazing story because she's from the school. Oh my goodness, I'm forgetting the school. It's not Morehouse. It's I forgot the name of it. Anyways, but Spelman. That's it, Spelman. And she's an amazing young woman who's an up and coming. She's going to be like a famous rap artist. And we all took the time to study this history, and she created this this amazing rap song that I think we all felt. And Meili Hunter was one of the producers who has this. She happens to be a Black Jewish woman who owns a huge production company in Atlanta. So I will call her today and find out how she can share this amazing song. I think she would really love to do that and get the lyrics for it.
Dr. Rogers, can you also say, I see someone in the chat asked how to get a copy of the documentary. And as you know, I have many friends who I've told about this movie who I think would love to have it. Mm-hmm. And there's a special story though about where it is. Can you share that with the group?
Well, right now, we've been asked by different states to do this film virtually. And what makes this film what made it so amazing is bringing people together in person. But now that we have time to really, kind of go back into the film, we were thinking, maybe we need to add the Black and Jewish groups that are working so hard today on together. And, we kind of left it as if when the movie was over, people felt, are there any groups that are working together? Whether it's the Andrew Goodman Foundation or some of the organizations that Heather Booth mentioned, American Jewish Committee, the Black Jewish Alliance, so that people, if they're inspired by this film, can get involved. So we might be going back into this film, especially given what's gone on, and just tweaking it a little bit. We're not 100% decided because as we were talking today with Joshua, this whole idea of, can we wait? This film does spark amazing dialogue, but at the same time, I understand, you know, the international importance of it and making sure that we've covered all the different angles we need to. So if anybody has any thoughts about the film or their opinions, I'd love to hear them. I'd welcome them. And this is way beyond all us. We are at a watershed moment, and we're hoping to, you know, I would love to hear your thoughts.
I believe firmly that the film is complete as it is and needs to be shared immediately as much as possible.
Yes.
That's my sense.
Yes, don't do anything to it. Yes, and I think that we will be encouraged if we could read some of the comments in the chat box. Will we be able to read those afterwards, Josh?
Will they be recorded, Neil, the chat?
I'm not really sure, but I've been taking notes.
Oh, wonderful.
Okay. But yeah, if we can capture the chat somehow, Danica, that would be ideal. Danica's the tech person. Someone did ask how to reach Dr. Rogers. Do you want to give any contact publicly?
Spill the Honey Foundation. I have a website. We actually have to make it much larger. I'm hoping to.
What's the website's name again, please?
Spill the Honey.
Spillthehoney.org.
Spill the Honey, yes. .com, spillthehoney.com.
So just Google Spill the Honey.
.com, and you'll be able to find me.
And Heather, what is your next big engagement? I know you must be extremely busy right now.
I'm working with a variety of groups, working for justice, working through the election, and trying to ensure that this is a country that meets the promise when it said, with freedom, justice, and democracy for all. So I'm working with a variety of groups. If we're saying our final comments, I wanted to leave people with a quote from Frederick Douglass, who was a great abolitionist of a previous round through the Civil War and then Reconstruction, which again, that is a history that also, the Lions didn't tell their history, so the Hunters told their history, but the amazing period of Reconstruction. But it was Frederick Douglass who said, "Those who profess to favor freedom, yet deprecate agitation, put down agitation, are those who want crops without plowing the land. They want the thunder they want the rain without the thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the roar of its mighty waters. Power concedes nothing without demand. It never did, and it never will. Now is the time for we join with people who are making the demand for that freedom, that justice for all, and reestablish the shared legacies that we have, that Jews have with African Americans, but on new terms, building on our past for a brighter future."
Claytee, do you want to make any closing?
Yeah, I've had a few multiple questions regarding getting in touch with the other panelists. Is it okay to share email addresses with the participants here for the three of you? If not, just let me know. Is that okay?
You may share my telephone number as well as my email address.
Sure.
Thank you. I will put it in the chat in a moment. So I just wanted to thank everybody, thank our panelists, thank our sponsors for today.